Hello, and welcome back to my Wheel of Time Diaries, where I talk spoiler discussion with a little bit of spoiler free to start about my reading of the Wheel of Time. This week we are now finally, after 2 months, beginning The Fires of Heaven, book 5 of the series. There we go, that didn't finish that word off. This was one that I admit I was feeling pretty excited to come back to. I was slightly underwhelmed at first with The Shadow Rising, probably my least favorite of the series so far, which is not a popular opinion, and because of certain ways that I felt about certain aspects of The Shadow Rising and because of other reading plans, it turned out that it was just going to be a bad idea to come back to this one quicker than I was ready. So by the time I actually started this a little over a week ago at the time that you're watching this, I was ready to come back. As for how much I read and how I felt about what I read, I can't really say too much about how I felt. I'm going to just say a general four stars, I suppose, for what I read this week. Maybe even a 5, I'll say. I was really enjoying the prologue, and then the first couple chapters have been pretty good as well. I've only read 60 pages out of the hardcover, about 9% of the book. Took me about 3.5 hours, and because of going out of town for a few days over the weekend, I wasn't able to get much further than that like I originally hoped. I'm hoping that I'll be able to get a higher average amount of pages read each week for this book than I did for The Shadow Rising, so that I don't have as many diaries about the same book, if that makes sense. What I felt about this beginning so far, it was a pretty strong one. Very strong in ways completely different than I would say the beginning of The Shadow Rising was, or any of the other books so far. This one has a lot more explicit political intrigue with the introductions going on than I would say my experience with the other books were, and I really like that aspect. And I would say the characterization has been pretty exciting, and certain aspects of the world building has shifted as well, although maybe not the world building explicitly, more like the lore in association with the world building has been expanded in ways that I have enjoyed thus far. As for the spoiler talks, I only got through the prologue and the first 2 chapters of the reading this week, but there is already plenty to talk about. My notes about all of these are relatively extensive already, which, came as a pretty big surprise to me, I'll say. For the prologue, I would say the most interesting thing about the prologue for me was in the back half, but it did start off actually with Elida's POV, the new Amerlin of the White Tower. Is that what Tarvalon is called? I forget already for some reason. All the very specific details after 2 months are slowly starting to seep out, but I'm getting the hang of things again already. Elida's position as Amerlin was an interesting POV to follow for the beginning of this book, especially compared to how the very beginning of The Shadow Rising was. It wasn't from Sanche's POV, which I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. I'm sorry. The previous Amerlin who was overthrown in The Shadow Rising. But the beginning was about Min and took place in the White Tower. So pretty similar setting, but a completely different take on it in this book compared to that one, where in that one things were peaceful. This one, things are in rather tumultuous behavior, we'll say, and Elida as the Amerlin doesn't seem to have a great hold on her followers, as I will say. Up to this point in the story, I would say I'm not sure how I feel about Elida's character. I've been very reserved and sort of undecided about her in the previous books, mostly because she seems to be pretty counter to Rand in a lot of ways. She seems to be a pretty, maybe angry is not the right word, but a pretty aggressive character, I would say. So far as Red Aes Sedai go, they're all relatively aggressive, or at least they're depicted to be pretty aggressive in most ways, and Elida is definitely one of those characters. And being in her head for a little bit more of an extended time in this prologue, I think it's probably the longest, unlimited's not the right word. It's probably the longest single scene that we've had from her POV up to this point in the series, which, like I said, was interesting. But it does switch, the prologue does switch very shortly into a POV from Padan Fain, and a meeting. Well, maybe it wasn't in Fain's POV. I think it actually might have stayed in Elida's POV. But either way, Padan Fain meets with Elida here in the tower, a moment and a scene and interaction that I will say I didn't actually see coming beforehand. I wasn't anticipating this, but it was interesting to see the way that Elida, already somebody who is pretty, maybe not skeptical, but pretty uncomfortable, all things considered, with Rand as a character, and especially with the Dragon Reborn. Padam Fain is able to essentially poison, influence her mind and her thinking about Rand to make her even more aggressive, even more uncomfortable with Rand as a character, which was a really interesting thing. I'm not sure how this specific plotline is going to continue. I don't know how forward it's going to be throughout the rest of the book, or in the immediate future of the books, but it will be interesting to see a little bit more about how Elida as the Amyrlin, what comes from this POV essentially. But as I was saying before, closer to the beginning of this segment, the later portion of the prologue was actually probably my favorite part of the prologue, and maybe my favorite part of the book so far already, in that we were able to meet a few more of the Forsaken who we did not know previously, and I was surprised by how much I was able to glean from this. It turns out that I know and have met now at some point in some degree, I think all but one of the Forsaken, if I'm not mistaken, because a few of them are already dead. I think 3 or 4 of them are already dead at this point. So that means that a decent handful of them are still living, and we now know a good chunk of them. 4 of them were in this prologue, those being Lanfear, Samael, Ravin, and Grandal. I'm probably pronouncing all those names wrong, of course, as normal, but then we also know Asmodean, who is with Rand, Moghedien, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that one wrong too, and Demandred. These 2 are elsewhere in the story, so that makes 7 of the remaining living ones that we know of. And then there's a couple others that I forgot about that died in, I guess, Eye of the World that I did not remember at that time, that someone reminded me of. It was like, okay, that was pretty nice to know. And then I, of course, already knew and remembered about Belal and Ishmael dying. So there's a lot going on with the Forsaken in this part of the prologue, but especially the meeting between these 4, as I said, Lanfear, Samael, Ravin, and Grandal. Pretty interesting plotting going on with these guys, how they expect to handle Rand, their plotting and discussions about it, their reservations about how they're going to deal with Rand and what his purpose is, and also revealing that basically the Forsaken know that somebody is not siding with Rand, but that one of the Forsaken is kind of like colluding with him in some way, to some degree, and not necessarily in the way that Asmodean is, because Asmodean is with Rand, like, essentially under arrest in some sense of the word. But we know, as the readers, this is sort of a dramatic irony, we know that Lanfear is the one trying to plot with Rand. And some of the other Forsaken actually accuse her of this, which I thought was funny. Like, oh, you were this way with Luce there, and so you're probably this way with Rand now if he's actually the Dragon Reborn and all this nonsense. It was a pretty funny moment. But they do know that somebody is kind of working against them to some degree with Rand, developing plots of their own. And I would not be surprised if more of the other Forsaken actually have plots of their own. Anyway, we'll see how that goes moving forward. I'm very interested to see a lot more from everything that came in the prologue. Set up the book pretty well. It wasn't an exciting prologue in the way that I think the Shadow Rising's prologue was a little bit more of. Then again, the Shadow Rising didn't really have a prologue. It was just a chapter 1. So if I've been saying prologue for the Shadow Rising throughout the video so far, I apologize for that. That was a mistaken detail on my part. But either way, I'm excited to see more from that stuff. Otherwise, the first couple chapters are starting to set some things up elsewhere. Chapter 1 follows a little bit more in the vein of Chapter 1 from The Shadow Rising, in that it follows the previous Amyrlin, Swan, and Min, and Leanne, and then also Loghain as well. There's some fun stuff going on with these guys. Loghain, well, the 4 of them are, refugees, essentially. They're escapees. They escaped the White Tower when Swan was overthrown in the last book, so now they're kind of like roaming around trying to find another place to go, living under pseudonyms essentially. And at one point, previous to this scene, but at one point they hide in a barn, and things go down and the barn, or was it a barn? I think it was a barn. Either way, things go down and property of one of the men in Andor is destroyed, and so Swan, Min, and Leanne have to face the consequences because Logain escapes in the aftermath of it. So here we're reintroduced to the character of Gareth Bryne, who I found fascinating because he is the sentencer of this decision, essentially, like, what punishment are these Aes Sedai, or rather these former Aes Sedai, going to face in the wake of this event. So Gareth Bryne accepts their oaths to serve him personally, but then when they're being sent to start service under Bryne, Swan and Min and Leanne are actually freed and rescued by Logain, which I didn't anticipate happening this early, but it does happen, and so they escape. And then we cap off this little moment, this little scene, with Bryne himself deciding to go after them because there's something that he finds familiar, or rather that he finds very intriguing about these people, that he feels like he needs to just go and follow them himself rather than just having other people bring them back to him. So whatever his deeper motivations behind this decision are, I'm not 100% sure yet, but I did like that part of it. Then in the last segment of Chapter 1, which I guess really Chapter 1 is mostly just like a second prologue at this point, introducing another new POV. I think it's the first time we've seen her POV. We get a segment from High Lady Altima. Altima? I don't know how to pronounce any of these names. Jordan made these names difficult, we'll say. We follow a POV from one of these High Ladies of Tyr, who, as I was reminded, because I knew that I recognized her name when I read it this morning, but couldn't figure out why I recognized her name. In the Shadow Rising, she was one of these political parties, basically trying to go against Rand, I believe the consensus was. I'm actually going to go back and search that up just really quickly because, you know, it's probably better to make sure that I'm actually saying the right things here than not. But where is she? High Lady Altima from the Shadow Rising. Says, forges a note about a relationship between her and High Lord Carleon. It is unknown whether this relationship actually exists or whether Tom was just trying to make two of the High Lords fight each other instead of Rand. Okay, so this was just a character that Tom was doing some political maneuvering with in the last book, which I do remember a scene about that, noting it down as like, this is probably something important, but I don't know why yet. I guess this is probably why it's setting up this little plot line here. Tom was doing some political maneuvering involving Altima that, I guess, scared her off, made her leave Tyr, uncomfortable being in Tyr with Rand and with, you know, the other political parties, thinking that she's going to be killed by someone. And I guess it's revealed that she is trying to kill her husband off because of some other reason related to this. Either way, Altima is actually meeting with Queen Morghese herself, the Queen of Andor, and we learn not just a little bit more about how Lord Gabriel's influence is over Morghese, but we also get some sort of subtle hints about how his character influences all other characters, not just the Queen, but other characters as well. So there's, like I said, a lot of other political maneuvering going on here. A lot of this is really just set up, so I don't know fully how to talk about it besides just saying, like, I'm interested in seeing where a lot of this stuff goes. It's all very cool material. I'm pretty excited to continue the book. But I did also read Chapter 2, which was Ruidian, and, well, there's not a whole lot to talk about here. There's three major points. First off, the chapter starts off with Rand having conversation, basically meeting with some of the chiefs of the Io clans that are following him, and they're basically discussing the other Io clans, how they plan to get them under Rand's sway, or to follow Rand as the Dragon Reborn, but for them as he who comes with the dawn. And also discussing the Shido clan and the fact that they will probably never be able to influence them to follow Rand. So there's some interesting stuff there, but the real interesting material from this chapter, and some really good character conflicts, actually. I really appreciated the way that Jordan wrote the conflicts between Rand and the approaching characters in the back half of the chapter, being Moiraine and Egwene. The character conflicts here were actually written pretty well, but Moiraine shows Rand one of the seals to the Dark One's prison, one of these Quendalar dishes, I suppose you could call them. And these dishes are supposed to be so strong that they cannot be broken except by the one power. And Moraine is able to show Rand that she can like scrape off parts of the seal just with a knife, and that's all the protection that the seal has. And so there's some consideration of whether the seal is real or if it's a fake or something, and we're able to determine that it's real, but that the seal is very weak. And if all of the other, four or six, I forget how many remaining seals there are to the Dark One's prison at this point, if all of them are as weak as this one is, that poses a lot of trouble. So I think this right here is specific setup for what this book is going to do. Maybe it'll be specifically searching for more seals so that, you know, as few of them as possible fall into enemy hands. That's my guess of what the book is going to do, but that's basically all the guess that I have, and I'm pretty sure, well, I would not be surprised if it was wrong, let's say. And then there was also one other thing that happened at the very end of this chapter. Actually, let me search something up real quick before I say anything about it. I want to see what about my theory might be right. Aha, I was right. So, at the very end of this chapter, Rand has a sort of internal thought referring to memories that he, as Rand al'Thor, has never had. Since we know that Rand al'Thor is the Dragon Reborn, and therefore Lews Therin Telamon Reborn, it seems like he might be experiencing memories or some such nonsense from Lews Therin specifically, so from previous versions of himself, or versions of himself from past ages, if that's how you want to put it. He has a memory, not a memory, just like a thought in his head as Lews Therin, referring to Ilyena, which was his wife. So, you know, interesting stuff there. Like I said, some setup for some stuff to come. Rand basically passes this off in the chapter as madness, you know, the madness that comes with being a male using the one power. And it seems like it's just going to be set up for Rand's character sort of becoming and reenacting, maybe not reenacting, but like coming into being the Dragon Reborn in a more literal sense, as being like the actual reincarnation of Lews Therin. He might start to shift as a character a little bit as this goes on. So that was the last thing that I really wanted to note here. Some really interesting setup stuff in the reading for the past week. So not a whole lot to like analyze or to really dig into my thoughts of. Like I said, it's mostly just me being interested in seeing how a lot of this continues, because it is mostly just set up for the future of the book, and in a couple cases maybe even the future of the series and future books. So that is my thoughts on the Fires of Heaven so far. Just 60 pages, 9% into the book. We'll see how much I get read over the next week. I'm hoping to get a lot done. I want to get a lot of reading in this done over the next couple weeks while I'm waiting on another project. And so that I can kind of plow through this a little bit faster than the Shadow Rising took. Doing 8 diaries, I believe, on the Shadow Rising was a little bit excessive. I want to keep that down to about 6 if I can for the Fires of Heaven. So that is what I'm going to work on this weekend, is just reading a lot of this book, and I'm very interested in doing so because of the content, as I've said before. So I hope if you watch this video that you enjoyed it. Sorry, I'm having issues with something over here trying to slide off, and I don't want to crash and bang and make loud noises or anything like that. I think my mom is napping in the next room. Either way, if you watch this video, thank you. And if you're interested in following my journey, each of the next several Thursdays, for as long as it takes me to read this book, I'll be doing something similar to this. If you've been watching any of the diaries up to this point, you know how these things go. So thank you guys for watching. I'll be back next week with whatever it is that I'm able to read in the Fires of Heaven over the next week. So we'll see what happens there. Like I said, one last time, thank you for watching. I'll be back next week.